The Middle East has just snapped into one of its most dangerous moments in decades. After a joint U.S.-Israel operation targeted Iran's leadership and military infrastructure, the region erupted into immediate retaliation and global markets lurched. Oil prices surged, insurers raised risk premiums on every vessel entering the Strait of Hormuz, and tankers scrambled to reroute. Energy analysts warned that a disruption of this size could ripple across supply chains from Asia to North America. And this is exactly where the story becomes far bigger than missiles and markets. Every time the U.S. escalates against Iran, the stress lands directly on global supply networks. Washington is now preparing for a prolonged crisis. The question is what this escalation means for America's closest neighbor, and what it reveals about the way Prime Minister Mark Carney is reshaping Canada's role in the world.
Canada stands with the Iranian people in their long and courageous struggle against this oppressive regime, and we reaffirm Israel's right to defend itself. Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security.
Carney's reaction came faster and clearer than many expected. He stated that Iran remains the principal source of instability in the Middle East, that the regime has one of the world's worst human rights records, and that Canada will never accept a nuclear-armed Iran. He reminded the country that Canada has already sanctioned more than 250 Iranian entities, designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and repeatedly called on Tehran to halt its enrichment program. Then he said the line that anchors Canada's position. Canada supports the United States and Israel in efforts to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. It was a firm endorsement of the security objective, delivered without theatrics and without any attempt to wrap it in partisan messaging. And that distinction matters. Carney's statement is not an endorsement of Trump's broader foreign policy. It is a reaffirmation of Canada's long-standing position that nuclear proliferation threatens every major democracy. The message is simple. Canada supports the mission because it supports the principle, not because it supports the American president leading the operation. This is Canada acting on its security commitments, not on political alignment. That nuance will define everything that follows.
Canada's support for the United States on the Iran crisis is firm, but it stops exactly where Canada's economic interests begin. Carney's endorsement of the security objective reflects Canada's long-standing opposition to nuclear proliferation, not a broader acceptance of Trump's geopolitical or economic agenda. And that boundary becomes clearer the moment attention shifts from the battlefield to the balance sheet. While the Middle East absorbs the shock of renewed conflict, Canada is not recalibrating its trade posture to appease Washington. Ottawa's mineral strategy, industrial policy, and diversification agenda continue uninterrupted. In fact, the crisis reinforces why Carney has spent the past year reducing Canada's exposure to American political volatility. At home, Canada is accelerating investment in critical minerals, nickel, copper, cobalt, and rare earth alternatives, materials the United States depends on to support both its defense sector and its energy transition. By tightening control over processing and restricting foreign takeovers, Ottawa is ensuring that these strategic assets strengthen Canadian leverage rather than dilute it. Across the Pacific, Canada is expanding its diplomatic and industrial footprint. Strengthening ties with South Korea, including the submarine program, signals a long-term shift in Canada's defense architecture that does not rely on American capacity. Carney's decision to engage Beijing directly at APEC underscores another point. Canada now conducts foreign policy according to its own strategic map, not as a subordinate executing U.S. expectations. Trump's tariff threats have not changed that trajectory. Instead of conceding, Carney is expanding export pathways, building alternative supply chains, and making clear that Canada will not allow any single partner, even the United States, to dictate its economic direction. This is the defining contrast. Canada stands with the U.S. on security, but not with Trump on trade. It is selective, intentional, and sovereign, the core of the Carney Doctrine. And under the pressure of this crisis, that doctrine is proving its strength.
The strategic significance of this moment for Canada becomes clear as the U.S.-Iran confrontation widens. Instead of reinforcing Washington's leverage over Ottawa, the crisis exposes how dependent the United States has become on Canada's stability, and how effectively Carney has positioned Canada to be indispensable while remaining economically independent. Energy illustrates this shift most clearly. With the Strait of Hormuz disrupted and global markets tightening, Canada's role as the largest and most reliable foreign supplier of crude to the United States becomes far more powerful. Canada is outside the conflict zone, insulated from regional shocks, and directly tied into U.S. refineries. That stability gives Ottawa a subtle but undeniable advantage at a time when Trump is still threatening tariffs on cars, metals, and industrial imports. Critical minerals reinforce the same pattern. The United States cannot sustain a modern defense buildup, especially during a crisis involving Iran, without Canadian imports. Carney's decision to expand domestic refining capacity, tighten control over strategic resources, and reduce foreign ownership now looks less like policy and more like foresight. Each step towards minerals independence reduces the force of any tariff Trump believes he can deploy. Diplomatically, Canada is showing the confidence of a country with options. From deeper cooperation with South Korea to growing ties with ASEAN and a direct line to Beijing at APEC, Carney is building a foreign policy that broadens Canada's influence rather than narrowing it to North America. Canada can support the U.S. on a vital security issue while simultaneously shaping an economic future that does not rely on American approval. In short, the Iran crisis is not pulling Canada back towards Washington. It is demonstrating why Carney's selective alignment strategy is working, strengthening cooperation where global security demands it, and strengthening Canada's leverage everywhere else.
The United States now faces a prolonged confrontation with Iran. Costs will rise, pressure will deepen, and Washington will rely more heavily on its closest allies. Canada has made clear it will stand with the U.S. when the issue is nuclear security, but just as clearly, it has shown that no military crisis, no tariff threat, and no strategic pressure will force it to surrender economic independence. The result is a new and uncomfortable question for Washington. If Carney supports the U.S. on Iran, yet refuses to bend on tariffs, minerals, and trade, what leverage does Trump actually have heading into the 2026 USMCA review? At this moment, Canada's message is unmistakable. Security alignment does not mean economic submission, and Trump may be entering USMCA 2026 with far less leverage than he expected.
Canada is no longer bracing for Trump's tariff storms, it's preparing to outrun them. In its newest national budget, the Carney government makes one thing unmistakably clear: the era of relying on a single export market is over. And this shift is far more dramatic than many Canadians realized. What looked like a routine fiscal document has quietly become a blueprint for a reshaped place in the global economy.
In previous budgets, a normal budget normally contains anywhere from 2 to maybe 5 at the most references to international trade. In the budget earlier this week, there were over 18 references to trade. So that kind of gives you a sense of how trade-focused this particular budget was.
A senior Canadian trade expert recently highlighted an extraordinary detail inside the federal budget. While past budgets mentioned international trade only 2 to 5 times, this year's document includes more than 18 separate references. That spike shows the government isn't simply reacting to Trump's tariffs, but building an entirely new playbook for how Canada intends to grow. The expert described how Canadian companies spent the last year scrambling to protect themselves as Trump's second-term tariff agenda intensified. Right after the U.S. election, exporters rushed as much as 6 to 8 months of inventory into the United States before the new tariffs hit. That move gave them breathing room, but did not change the underlying problem. As months passed and tariffs remained locked in place, companies accepted a difficult truth: the old model is not coming back. They are now focusing on long-term adjustments, considering where their products should be manufactured, how supply chains should be redesigned, and which global markets can replace the United States as dependable buyers. Inside the budget, the most significant new tool is a strategic export office housed in Global Affairs Canada. The initiative is designed to help businesses break into non-U.S. markets by cutting domestic red tape, navigating foreign rules, and coordinating federal support with trade teams already stationed overseas. For many firms that struggled for years with overseas regulations, legal costs, and market access barriers, this marks a major shift. For decades, Canada built its economic identity on one pillar. The United States would always remain an open, stable, and reliable trading partner. Trump's second term shattered that assumption. His administration has rolled out sweeping tariffs across steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, and manufactured goods, with rates ranging from 10 to 100%, forcing Canadian policymakers to confront a harsher global landscape. The dramatic jump from a handful of trade measures to more than 18 shows that Ottawa now sees diversification not as an option, but a necessity. The new budget reads like a manual for a country preparing its economy for a multipolar world, where access to the U.S. market can no longer be taken for granted.
The experts' insights revealed how deeply Canadian exporters hoped Trump's tariff wave would fade as it did in 2018 and 2019. But this time, months passed and nothing changed. Many companies initially relied on temporary tactics, including adjusting internal prices to reduce tariff exposure. But these measures were never meant to last. As the situation dragged on, businesses accepted that long-term redesign is unavoidable. They began scouting new manufacturing locations, researching buyers in Asia and Europe, and preparing multilingual marketing and legal materials for entirely new regions. This transformation is expensive, slow, and administratively heavy, which is precisely why the government finally stepped in with structural support.
The Strategic Export Office could become one of the most consequential trade reforms of this decade. Instead of leaving companies to navigate overseas barriers alone, the office will serve as a centralized command structure for Canada's export expansion. It will help firms clear Canadian administrative hurdles, coordinate federal departments, guide them through foreign regulatory requirements, assist with patent and intellectual property protections, and connect them directly with potential buyers through trade officials on the ground in foreign markets. For years, exporters complained that breaking into Asia or Europe required layers of expensive legal advice, translation work, compliance checks, and local contacts, all before a single sale could happen. This office is designed to eliminate those barriers and make diversification attainable even for medium-sized companies. Trump's second-term trade policy has moved far beyond traditional protectionism. Canada now faces 25% tariffs on most non-energy goods and 10% tariffs on energy exports, alongside new threats against the auto sector and broader use of national security tariff tools. These measures are not tied to long-term strategy, but to domestic politics, making them unpredictable and difficult to negotiate around. Even U.S. farmers and manufacturers, once seen as beneficiaries of Trump's agenda, are experiencing volatility as global buyers shift to more stable suppliers in South America and Asia. In this environment, Canada cannot afford to anchor its prosperity to a market that can change direction overnight. Carney's budget aligns with the broader foreign policy transformation Canada has been building all year. Ottawa is accelerating partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN, building new clean energy and defense ties, and preparing for expanded trade opportunities with China following the APEC diplomatic reset. This diversification strategy is strengthened by Canada's growing role in critical minerals, lithium, copper, nickel, rare earths, which are becoming indispensable to global clean tech and EV supply chains. Domestically, the budget expands incentives for clean manufacturing in Ontario and Quebec, helping anchor new export sectors that can operate beyond North America. Taken together, these measures reflect a Canada that is no longer trying to pressure Washington or outmaneuver Trump. It is building alternatives. The domestic political debate around this budget has been intense. Opposition parties have criticized the rising deficit but have struggled to challenge the underlying need for trade diversification. Export-focused industries, meanwhile, have quietly expressed relief that Ottawa is finally embracing a long-term strategy. This is the first budget in many years that acknowledges global reality rather than assuming stability from the United States. The government is signaling that Canada's prosperity must come from a wider geographic base,
one that reduces dependence on a single, politically turbulent partner.
Canada has entered a new phase of its economic life. Instead of waiting for U.S. policy to stabilize, it is building its own path forward. The budget's 18 trade-focused measures reflect a government and a business community finally aligned in recognizing the long-term implications of Trump's tariff regime. The question now is not whether Canada should diversify, that debate is over, but whether it can move fast enough to secure new markets before the next round of U.S. tariffs reshapes the rules again. Canada has laid the groundwork. Companies are adapting. The political will is forming. But the transformation will require speed, coordination, and willingness to bet on a more global future. And so we end with this. Can Canada complete this pivot in time, or will the next wave of U.S. pressure arrive before the new strategy fully takes hold?